Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will.
Yeah, right.
I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcoming into the Bet the Board podcast, college football edition. The weeks continue to fly by. We get a better idea of the four teams, at least theoretically, that'll be vying for the college football playoff as these conference championship races heat up. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, hopefully you're doing well this morning.
Doing very well.
No complaints.
That is a good thing at this point in the season as we inch ever so close to the Thanksgiving holiday and still so much to be decided on the college football front. I mean, we can belabor the points that we saw last night from the College Football Playoff Committee, Georgia jumping over Ohio State, but let's not pretend we're splitting the atom. Those teams went out. They're going to be just fine in the big picture. An undefeated Big Ten champion and an undefeated Georgia ain't getting left out. Florida State controls their own destiny, much like a lot of these other programs do. So now that we have that out of the way, we may as well go to Neyland Stadium and talk a little Georgia and Tennessee, a game that would have carried a heck of a lot more intrigue had Tennessee done their part last weekend. Alas, they did not, for listeners and fans of Vol Nation. Ron Slaypane went eerily quiet when I asked him about that particular performance in Columbia, but I'll have to pick on him a little bit later. Tennessee finds themselves a 10.5-point home underdog as they'll welcome in the undefeated Georgia Bulldogs. Total on the game, 59. The SEC title game we know is set. Georgia will take on Alabama, but still work to do in the interim. When you look at Georgia, they can tie the longest win streak in SEC history with its 28th win in a row, which would match a pair of Alabama streaks for the conference record. They've won 5 of their last 6 trips to Knoxville and covered 6 of the last 7 meetings, won each of the last 6 meetings, all by 14-plus points. Last year was the first time Tennessee closed as a single-digit dog, and it was Georgia emerging in Athens 27-13. Meanwhile, for Tennessee, discipline has been a big problem for the Vols. This is a group that ranks 130th in the country in penalties in home games this season, and they're going to have to clean an awful lot of that up if they're going to pull off their second major upset in as many seasons against a top-tier opponent. Brad, the Georgia offense last week, they may have started slow, and I use that term facetiously, before they hit the ground running. 611 yards of offense versus Ole Miss, the most for the Bulldogs since 2020. Scored a touchdown in each of their first 4 possessions. I mean, this is a group averaging more than 35 points per game and 480-plus yards of offense away from home. They get Brock Bowers back. Carson Beck continues to look the part, and lo and behold, Georgia now has a ground game matched up against the Tennessee defense that looked ill-equipped to slow down anything Missouri threw at them. When you look at Georgia's offense against this Tennessee defense, we know they've benefited from home cooking in Knoxville in the past, but do they have enough on that side of the ball to slow down this Bulldog juggernaut?
Yeah, from what I saw, if we're going recency bias, from what I saw last week, no, they do not. What I see with Georgia's offense is an offense that's peaking at the right time of the season. And it makes sense considering if you start going back through the season and knowing what they dealt with on the injury front. Obviously, last week you get your tight end Bowers back, although he didn't look 100% to me, and I would anticipate he's still on a bit of a snap count here, but as he gets back in his groove. Obviously, you put Mims back in the lineup on the offensive line. He's a key cog there. You saw the right side of the offensive line really dominate Ole Miss last week. McConkey missed some games early in the season. He's kind of that safety valve for Carson Beck. The running back position was banged up. Edwards missed the first couple of games. He got going, and then we saw last week Milton really got going. I mean, Milton's number 15 in the country in weighted EPA per play, so you got a couple of running backs. You got your tight end getting healthier. year. Your wide receiver core is as deep as it's been. And then most importantly is you got a quarterback in Carson Beck. Now that he's got 10 starts under his belt, he's looking more and more comfortable with game experience. 1 pick in the last 3 games combined. And keep in mind, the competition for Georgia's stepped up here in recent weeks after the bye. And then I thought, Mike Bobo, the new offense coordinator, is starting to find his groove a little bit. He's not Todd Monken, but I do find it interesting that if you look at Georgia's offensive drive efficiency, touchdown rate per drive, points per drive, better this year than last year. Now, schedule's been easier this year so far than compared to the entirety of last year's schedule, but this is a Georgia offense that, the basic metrics say number 5 in yards per play, number 5 in yards per game, number 6 in points per game. This is a team that looks like a top 5 caliber offense at this point. Now they're facing a Tennessee defense. You mentioned lack of discipline. That's exactly what showed up last week. It was unbelievable. Questionable effort from coaches, players, out of position, didn't want to tackle. I thought I saw loafing out there. Play calling was bad. Second time I've seen that this year. It showed up on tape in the Florida game, particularly in the second half when Florida just ran right at them. They got lit up by Kentucky in the pass game, got run over in the run game by Florida and Missouri. And now they're facing a balanced Georgia offense. Unless they play their most disciplined game of the season, unless they're able to get consistent pressure, which has been their major strength this season, but really, didn't dial up a lot of pressure last week. I don't see a clear-cut pathway for Tennessee to have a lot of success here defensively unless, Georgia just regresses completely, which I don't think is going to be the case. So, advantage Georgia offense here.
I think Cody Schrader, Brad, actually just picked up another 100 yards from scrimmage in terms of running and receiving against the Tennessee defense, and the game's been over for 72 hours plus, given what we saw on Saturday afternoon in Columbia.
Those couple plays before the half, are you kidding? Tennessee is in scoring position. We're going to have a tie ball game probably at halftime. They turn it over. All Missouri does is run Schrader twice, and he picks up like 50 yards. What the hell is going on, man? That was just pathetic.
I'm watching that, Brad, going, you know what? This is as bad a half as Tennessee could have possibly played. They're going to have a chance to tie the game, regroup at the half, and come out with a better attack plan, given how it was a bend but don't break mentality with Missouri going for 300 yards in that first half. And to your point, they've turned the ball over there. Missouri looks like they want to run the clock out, kick the field goal, and then score on the opening drive of the second half, and it was pretty much good night sweetheart in every aspect of the game. And Payne, obviously the Vols defense was a disappointment last week, but the offense wasn't much better. 7 points last week against the Tigers, the fewest points a Josh Heupel team has ever scored. The previous low was 13 last season against these Georgia Bulldogs. And when you look at Josh Heupel's offense, the fewest they've ever scored at home, 17, happened 2 years ago. Hey, lo and behold, the common denominator, Georgia. The blueprint for Tennessee has been to run the football, and when they don't do that, it puts a burden of proof on Joe Milton. In steps a Georgia defense that's going into a different environment than they played in last week, but you have to imagine it is a huge advantage knowing that they face pace and tempo in familiar surroundings. Last week against Ole Miss, it won't be the same shock to the system at Neyland Stadium on Saturday.
These are typically the toughest games for bettors if you're too emotional, right? You back a team 1 week, they absolutely no-show, and they're dead to you now because you believe their very worst performance of the season is now their baseline. And, the vast majority of the time that's not true.
How dare you?
And then after you've discarded that team, you flip on the TV and they look like $1 million the very next game. So I think it's unlikely.
It's coming. You bet your ass it's coming on Saturday, boys. Bet your ass.
Yeah. I don't envision Tennessee doing that in this spot. We're 6 years into the Joe Milton experience, right? Josh Heupel is certainly better than Derek Dooley and Butch Jones, but that bar is quite low. I think at this point, people know my feelings on both the Vols quarterback and coach, so it's probably best to focus on an area where if you do kind of plop on the couch with your favorite adult beverage there and watch this game and you're like, how is this the same Vols team? It's probably because they located the ground game. And the incessant penalties, to your point, Todd, kind of dissipated a little bit. But I look at Georgia, and yes, they've shown another gear in the biggest games, whether it was for a sector or a whole game. A lot of that, to Brad's point, has come on offense as they've started to trend healthier. Defensively, though, I mean, the Dogs aren't on the historical 2021 level, or even I think the great 2022 unit they had last year. And you can kind of tell, like, Kirby trusts his talent in the front to consistently win so he can, allocate more guys into coverage. Georgia shows a lot of six-man boxes. And I think even the most, avid Dogs fan would say, like, the six in the front this season aren't as talented as years past. And so you saw Missouri go out and generate 3 yards per rush before first contact against Georgia. 55% of the Tigers runs great successful. And, for large stretches of that game, Georgia didn't have to worry about Luther Burden. Now, all of a sudden, that data point looks a little bit better after what Missouri did on the ground last week. But even, you go to the Georgia blowout against Ole Miss. Ole Miss's rushing attack was successful at a rate 6% higher than what Georgia's allowed as a season-long average. The game script kind of just got away. There's some injuries in the defensive front for Georgia. Brad mentioned last week that their lead linebacker, Dumas Johnson, fractured his wrist. In the Ole Miss game, Georgia's defensive tackle, Zion Rogue, was part of kind of this three-man rotation inside with Stackhouse and Brinson. He's banged up, according to Kirby Smart, and it was kind of a let's see if he's able to go. But like before the disappointing effort last week, the Vols ground game, was the more efficient part to its offense. They were top 10 in explosive run rate, top 30 in both down-to-down rushing success and EPA. You have a nice little trio there with Wright and Sampson and Small, who have all been solid. And I think if Georgia's going to go with these six-man fronts, and I hate to preface it this way, Joe Milton isn't playing meaningful football games for you really in the future. It's probably time to create that extra man advantage in the box with him as a decisive forward downhill runner.
Good point.
That's really the path, right? Tennessee has to have their ground game going. Maybe you get another 30-minute anomaly from Joe Milton as a passer that, rivals the Alabama game in combination with, an efficient ground attack. And that's kind of how you have a competitive game. But I don't know if anyone would ever project that type of 30-minute performance again from Joe Milton here against Georgia.
Look, I mean, I'm not even blaming Joe Milton for what I saw last week. I mean, yes, he threw some balls into the stands that could have been caught somewhere, else on the Missouri campus. But I mean, he went out there.
We have 6 years. We've got 6 years.
Oh, look, I'm not calling him
right. You know what I'm saying?
You know what?
First 30 minutes against Alabama, like
I'm just waiting for your head.
Probably never happening.
I'm waiting for your head to explode.
Here they come this week.
Waiting for your head to explode when Joe Milton is a second-day draft pick in the NFL, because it's tantalizing arm talent that some scout isn't going to be able to pass up.
He's going to look good in tights throwing it 70 yards from his knees. There's no doubt about it.
100%. You get him out there chucking it around, throwing it a good old country mile like Napoleon Dynamite, throwing over those mountains over there, and suddenly Joe Milton finds himself into an NFL camp with a chance to play on Sundays as a backup. If Matt Corral could go in the third round of the NFL draft and a team could trade up for him, somebody is going to take a flyer on Joe Milton. We'll see exactly what the Vols look like this weekend at home against the Georgia Bulldogs. Into the ACC, gentlemen, North Carolina at Clemson. North Carolina needed every bit of a 47-point offensive explosion to slip by the Duke Blue Devils in overtime last weekend. They'll go to Death Valley to take on Clemson. 6.5 as far as the number here, with Clemson installed as a favorite. Total on the game, 58. North Carolina hasn't won since Clemson's last losing season in 2010, beating the Tigers. When you look at the game, 21-16 in Chapel Hill, it's the only win in 9 meetings since 2002. These teams don't play nearly as often as they should, but last year did meet in the ACC title game, where Clemson, at least on the scoreboard, won that game convincingly 39-10, despite finishing the game -1 in total yardage. North Carolina, meanwhile, remains alive in the ACC championship game race. They need to finish with wins at Clemson and NC State, and have Payne's beloved Miami Hurricanes knock off Louisville this week for that to happen. When you look at North Carolina, we know that this is a team with an explosive, high-powered offense, and it'll be the first time this year they enter a game as an underdog. 5-game sample size where they've caught points with Drake May as their starting quarterback. 3-2 straight up, 4-1 ATS, and it appears everyone in Chapel Hill embracing that underdog mentality this week. On the other side, Clemson, 45 wins in 47 home games, come in off their most dominating performance of the season, a 42-21 victory over Georgia Tech, and the largest margin of victory over an ACC opponent since last year's 29-point shellacking over North Carolina in the title game. Brad, when we look at North Carolina offensively, Amario Hampton has been outstanding, putting up crooked numbers. We've seen what Tez Walker has meant to this North Carolina passing attack. Drake May is the guy that we thought he was going to be, 7 straight games with 3+ touchdowns. But here comes a Clemson defense that introduced a lot of unfamiliar faces, and the freshman made an immediate impact, making Haynes King's life absolutely miserable last Saturday.
Yeah, here we are in mid-November. This is a very intriguing data point for the fact that this is obviously strength on strength here. It's the best defense that North Carolina is going to face at this point in the season by far, and on the opposite side, it's the best offense that Clemson's defense is going to face so far this season. So this is a very intriguing matchup just to see how good these units are. I'm anxious to see how North Carolina attacks this game. Obviously, even with Drake May at quarterback, they've run more than pass this year. You mentioned it. They've had some success in Hampton, but, you do have Drake May at quarterback. I'd throw as much as possible. And May, I got to be honest, has forced some passes watching a lot of their games this year. He hasn't been... It's not like he took his game on a whole nother level this year compared to last year. He's still obviously one of the best quarterbacks in the country. He certainly has looked better with Tez Walker in the lineup after he was out the first 3-4 games of the season. The concern that I have here in the matchup to really look for where, Clemson will have an edge is the North Carolina offensive line. Payne mentioned this even at the start in the preview. A lot of experience for this offensive line. But I don't know if it's overly talented. And against 2 of the better defensive lines North Carolina's faced this year, Pitt and Miami, they gave up 10 sacks. I don't know if that bodes well against this Clemson front. The front, you mentioned the freshman, and you got some also experience there. In the linebacker position, Trotter and Carter is as good as it gets in the entire country. But I will say this, Clemson's pass defense looks good on papers, the basic counting stats, but they haven't faced anybody like North Carolina. I know that they had their way with Sam Hartman, but keep in mind, that was the first game without Mitchell Evans, Notre Dame's tight end. That's their best receiving option. They were down 2 more wide receivers already on a wide receiver position for Notre Dame that's been banged up and really not that talented to begin with all year. So I'm anxious to see how Clemson's pass defense holds up against by far their best pass attack. So I don't know if there's value in the number, and Payne can talk about this. My numbers say lean Clemson here, but to me, it's more of just an intriguing matchup just to see how good these 2 units really are.
Brad, you mentioned that Clemson secondary. They've now held 6 straight opponents under 200 yards passing, and we look at that murderer's row. Syracuse, Wake Forest, the Emory Williams-led Miami Hurricanes offense, North Carolina State, who I don't think knows what a forward pass is, although they did win that game as a home underdog, the aforementioned Irish, and of course Georgia Tech last week, probably the most meaningful data point of all of them. Meanwhile, Payne on the other side, Clemson offensively, they hit their season-high rushing total against Georgia Tech, 260 yards in the win. First game since the opener, they were able to show the kind of balance that Clemson expected all season long with 200 yards rushing and 200 yards passing. Will Shipley and Maffa split the carries. Shipley asked about his future with Clemson. Very non-committal. Tells me he's probably taking his talents to the next level. Cade Klubnik, look, his coming out party came against North Carolina in the ACC title game, and they created a lot of optimism. Coming into this season, he clearly hasn't lived up to that hype, but it may not be entirely on him against the North Carolina defense that is more than happy to give up chunk yardage on the ground and do so in spades.
Yeah, we are talking the same language. I think that's the path here. North Carolina has seen a lot of smash mouth football over the last month. You look at Virginia's path, right? They pounded it 51 times against UNC. Georgia Tech 48 times. Campbell even ran it 37 times and were down the entire game. Duke ran it 41 times. You start to look at North Carolina's defense. They played 6 straight weeks and are coming off an overtime game. You just wonder if some of the key cogs along that front 7 are starting to feel some fatigue. You look at guys like Rutger and Gray and Eccles, they're averaging almost 70 snaps a game. North Carolina's given up 5.2 a carry over this 4-game stretch. You'll look on the season, North Carolina is outside the top 80 in schedule-adjusted defensive line yards allowed, rushing success rate allowed, explosive rushing allowed. So all of those relative improvements we thought were there through maybe the midway point are starting to kind of subside a little bit. And it's certainly a better defense than last year, but it's not markedly improved, I don't think. Clemson has the Maffa-Shipley tandem back together again. Not quite as good, I think, as you hoped for coming into the season. Clemson's front has been solid. They are now down 2 starters from the initial group that came into the season. But you just look, top quarter in all of college football getting push up front. Run game has been in that top 25 range in both success and explosiveness for Clemson. I think Clemson can do some things on the ground to where it opens up the possibilities of a few explosives through the air in the RPO game. UNC still outside the top 100 in explosive pass defense. You mentioned last year's data point. I think it's really relevant because, Cade had folks really excitable about his future because of that very matchup in the ACC championship game against Gene Chizik and this North Carolina defense. He went 20 for 24, nearly 12 yards per pass attempt. I think if you said, hey, this game played true and straight and Clemson finished drives and they didn't turn it over at the most inopportune times, you'd feel really good laying on anything under 7 here, just based upon, piggybacking off Brad's hint that the number might be a touch short.
Hey, look, I'm not a big trends guy, gentlemen, but, since Tyler from Spartanburg laid into Dabo Sweeney, Clemson is now 2-0, both straight up in ATS. So you have to factor that into the handicapping. When Dabo gets called out by the fan base, whether he was planted or not, they've been a little bit more buttoned up, and you'd have to think, to both of the points that you guys made, there is a path to success for Clemson offensively, and if they can make UNC one-dimensional, you do begin to fear for Drake May in known passing situations against this defense. Detour, though, time away from a little bit of Power 5 football and the ACC into the good old Sun Belt in Statesboro, Georgia is where we're headed for Mr. Powers this week. Georgia Southern, a 6-point favorite as they'll welcome in the Old Dominion Monarchs. Total on this game, 60.5, 61. When you look at ODU, they come in riding a 3-game losing skid, but it hasn't exactly been against lightweights within the conference. James Madison, Coastal Carolina, and Liberty. As far as Georgia Southern on the other side, this is a group that has failed to exceed odds makers' expectations all that often. A game against Georgia State appears to be the anomaly over their last 5. But Brad, where have you found a little bit of an edge that you think is worth exploiting in this particular contest?
Yeah, we're going to go with the underdog here, Old Dominion plus the 6. A little bit of money obviously showed on Old Dominion about 24 hours ago in the market. I agreed with it. Basic fundamentals as far as handicapping this time of year. Old Dominion, better yards per play margin, very simple stat. But where it catches my eye is they played a much tougher schedule. 40 spots higher in conference play. That's about as big as it gets this time of year, late in the season. So better team statistically against a tougher schedule. And it's been, besides if you eliminate last week's game, which was a bad data point for Old Dominion, it's been really tough to get margin on this team against good competitions. Some of the best teams that they played this year. 3-point loss to Wake Forest, 6-point loss against Marshall, 3-point loss James Madison, 4-point loss Coastal Carolina. All teams similar, if not better than this Georgia Southern team. And speaking of this Georgia Southern team, I like big market moves this time of year to follow and see, obviously what the result was. And as big of a move as we've seen in recent weeks was it happened against Georgia Southern a couple weeks ago against Texas State. The market moved 4 points late in the week against them. Ended up being right because, obviously they were not the right side from start to finish in a blowout loss. Market was even lukewarm against them last week against a Marshall team that had failed to cover 6 games in a row. Marshall ends up with a backup quarterback, and what happens? Georgia Southern loses the game. So this is the Georgia Southern team not trending well, unlike the team up in Athens, the northern more part of the state there. So I just think it's an Old Dominion team that I'm reading the quotes this week. They're going to fight, and they're saying all the right things as far as trying to get to bowl eligibility. They've been a lot better than what I expected this year. I didn't expect them to be at 4 wins at this point. Let's go ahead and take the dog here, Old Dominion plus 6.
No doubt a team that has exceeded a lot of people's expectations when you look at the way that they were bet against early in the year and still continue to get out there and fight last week against Liberty notwithstanding. Payne, I don't want you to feel like you're left out of the group of 5 party, so is there anything you'd like to add on this contest? And if not, there are going to be plenty of other opportunities later in the program for you to interject should you so choose.
Well, listen, I don't want to mess with tradition. It feels like every time I talk about this, it's a dead nut winner, just like last week with San Jose State. I unfortunately agree with this. because I think all of us are holding under 4.5 win tickets on Old Dominion. And I actually somehow caught myself watching Old Dominion and James Madison and immediately thought to myself, well, that's dead, and how the hell did we arrive here? But this is got a lot of confirmation. Let's put it that way. Before it hit the screen publicly yesterday, there was 2 buy orders that came in on it off screen. So Old Dominion quite sharp this week.
Monarchs live on the road in Statesboro on Saturday. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me on X the exact same way. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. All right, gentlemen, from the Sun Belt to the Big 12, and it is the annual Sunflower Showdown, or I think I'm calling that the right rivalry. I'm not even quite sure. Between Kansas and Kansas State. It's the Wildcats, more than a touchdown road favorite for their annual trip to Lawrence, or biannual, I guess I should say. Total in the game, 56.5. The most interesting storyline, guys, that I tracked down this week is the Big 12 is still trying to figure out exactly what the tie-breaking scenarios will be for the conference championship game between Oklahoma State, Kansas State, should they both have a chance to get there. This will mark the 121st meeting between the Jayhawks and Wildcats. It will become Kansas's most played rivalry, surpassing the 120 all-time games played between Kansas and Missouri. Also becomes the 4th sellout of the season in Lawrence and the 7th under head coach Lance Leipold. When you look at Kansas State, it has been nothing but one-way traffic and roadkill for the Jayhawks. Last 4 Kansas State wins in the series have come by a combined margin of 176-61. They've won their last 7 trips to Lawrence since Kansas's last win in the series overall, coming back in 2008. And Kansas State really appears to have found some footing. Yes, they lost to Texas a few weeks ago, but it's a team that has a clear identity going forward. Meanwhile, Kansas has plenty of questions swirling about who will be under center for them come Saturday afternoon, but their 7 wins are the most in a season since finishing 8-5 back in 2008, and it'll also be Kansas's first winning season in more than 10 years. Brad, when we look at Kansas's offense, Jalen Daniels gave them one dynamic. Jason Bean, we knew, was more than a capable backup, but Bean wasn't able to complete the game last week against Texas Tech. In steps Cole Ballard, and while he led a valiant comeback effort, he clearly lacks some of the athleticism, some of the poise, and the command of the offense, being a third stringer. But KU had 3 straight scoring drives of 70-plus yards in the fourth quarter. Unfortunately for the Jayhawks, had to settle for 2 field goals in that spot. But moving the ball against Texas Tech is one thing. Moving the ball against a relatively similar defense in terms of concept in the 3-3-5 in the Wildcats could be something entirely different.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the major handicap here on either side of the ball is the health status of Jason Bean, Kansas quarterback. Lance Leipold said yesterday he's very optimistic that Bean's going to play. It is a head injury, and man, in today's day and age, I actually take a more pessimistic approach. And we have seen Kansas State, a lot of buy orders at 7, I'll put it that way, on Kansas State earlier this week. The question you got to ask yourself, do you believe Leipold? If you do, and Bean plays, then I could see how someone says, give me the home underdog here more than a touchdown. If he doesn't, then this number is considerably short. You mentioned Cole Ballard did a great job in the fourth quarter, 13 points. Reality is he doesn't give you a rushing dynamic like Bean does. He doesn't even really give you a passing dynamic either. I mean, even with that fourth quarter performance, he was 9 out of 20, 134 yards and an interception. Keep in mind, he's a freshman walk-on. He took several big hits as well. I mean, he's got to protect himself because he himself took 3-4 big hits in the game. Obviously, Jalen Daniels, you would expect to be shut down, so there's really no chance for him to play. And look, Bean being a backup, you mentioned it, Todd, even with him being a backup, he's very capable. He's number 16 in the country in weighted EPA per play. So this is a drop-off that would be at least a minimum 3 points if he got ruled out late in the week. So what do I expect? If Bean plays, then obviously you're going to, this Kansas offense is very capable. I mean, they have one of the best offensive coordinators in the country in Kotelnicki. I mean, everybody loves him. Very unique formations, variety of looks and formations and motions, pre-snap. If Bean doesn't play, what I saw in the game, I would expect to see some double running back sets, more double tight end sets, and try to run at a Kansas State defense that, just a couple games ago, Texas was able to run at them. But other than that, Kansas State's been good at stopping the run. This is a defense that sums greater than the parts. I mean, when I'm watching games, I like to highlight different players that stand out to me from a scouting perspective. I don't have much on Kansas State's defense. Here's what I got. I mean, individual players, Duke off the edge is all right, but they're very well coached. They're fundamentally sound. They tackle well. They keep the points down. If there's one thing that they do, they play field position. They force turnovers. They're plus 10 overall as a team the last 5 games. The explosives aren't great, though. Missouri got them through the air. Again, Kansas will be able to if Bean plays. They'll probably take some shots. But I'm also intrigued that their middle linebacker, Jake Clifton, again, not a guy that's got a lot of stats, but he's been their starter this year. He got hurt last week. He'll be out for the rest of the season, so it'll be interesting to see how they respond to that. I'm going to give the slight edge to Kansas State because, again, I'm taking more of a pessimistic approach. If Bean plays, I don't know if they're going to run him as much coming off the head injury. And if Bean's out, big edge, Kansas State. Yeah,
you mentioned the Wildcat defense, and the word that I always think of when I watch them is nondescript in terms of a lot of the things that they do. In terms of some of the metrics, they don't overwhelm you, but they do the little things right more often than not. And an interesting nugget from the Kansas State website, they talked about how this defense has shown drastic improvements from a points per game standpoint that you highlighted, Brad, since going to the 3-3-5 defensive alignment in the start of 2021. Now at 37-game sample size, and State has allowed just 20.6 points per game to tie for 16th in the country during that span, and they're the second best from a points per game standpoint in the Big 12 over that sample size. On the other side, Payne, when we look at Kansas State offensively, it's a group that's ultra efficient in the red zone when it comes to scoring touchdowns. Texas is the only team in the Big 12 that's really been able to silence this ground attack as they've run for 179 or more yards against every league opponent, not named Texas. They check in as a top 15 group in terms of their ability to establish that on the ground. Will Howard broke Josh Freeman's school record for touchdown passes last week, and while they did lean on that gimmick a little bit with him and Avery Johnson, it appears to be much more Will Howard's ship to kind of steer. On the other side of the coin, there's the Jayhawks defense that have really struggled to stop the ground game for teams that are relatively pedestrian in the grand scheme of things, but they did just allow 211 combined rushing yards against Iowa State and Texas Tech. When you look at the purple power offensively against the Jayhawks defense, where do you see an edge or a X's and O's advantage that one team can exploit?
Everywhere. There's not really a path to stops for Kansas unless the turnover bug bites Kansas State. And it's just unlikely that Kansas is going to stop the physicality of Kansas State up front. That offensive line has started to really click and hum now that it's healthy. The onset of the season, there was some shuffling going on with some injuries on the right side of that line. But now that's in the past, you're starting to see a real force there. And to your point, the only team that was really able to dominate them up front was Texas. And once Kansas State kind of figured that out, they shifted focus and started kind of surging from there late second quarter onwards. But you look specific to this matchup, Kansas State's offensive line, top 15 in creating yards. They have this nice two-headed monster in the backfield with Giddens and Ward, and that's led to a top 10 EPA rushing attack. Will Howard obviously adds that nice dimension with his legs as well at times. Kansas right now is allowing over 6 yards per carry this season. They're outside the top 120 in EPA per rush allowed. If Will Howard is ahead of the down and distance, he's a good quarterback. He is just so much more comfortable playing pitch and catch in that scenario. And I think because Kansas has issues defending the run and the short passes, and their opponents just live in manageable situations, Will Howard isn't going to have to throw it that often in this matchup where it's a negative script to him. You look at the matchup last season, Will Howard didn't really have to throw it at all. But when he did, it was downfield. 48% of his throws traveled 10-plus yards. So you can, take some shots from time to time if Kansas eventually has to load the box, which I think is probably going to happen here. We kind of thought early on in the season, the Jayhawks defense made some, relative strides. You kind of zoom out and look at the whole season. It is it's as bad as it gets, right? Bad on early downs, bad on late downs. They're bad down to down. They've given up a ton of explosives. You think, hey, maybe they've hit the red zone roulette and gotten fortunate there where they hunker down in the green zone. That has not been the case at all. They give up scores when teams hit their green zone, when teams hit their red zone. It's real bad for the Jayhawks defense, and this is an extremely difficult matchup. And I think, if Jason Bean is out, then not going to be much of a rivalry game here.
No, and I think, you guys highlighting where this number opened, where it's gone, now sitting in no man's land. Brad, to your point, if Bean gets ruled out, it's an easy move for odds makers to manually adjust that thing up to 10. And if we see Bean get upgraded, go back to a touchdown and get a better understanding and gauge of where professional bettors may be inclined to place their cash closer to kickoff on Saturday. From the Big 12, in terms of teams currently in the conference to two teams that will be in the conference beginning next year, but still reside in the Pac-12, Utah heads on the road to Tucson to take on the upstart Arizona Wildcats. It's Arizona, a 1-point favorite, total on the game 45. And the Wildcats will seek their first win versus Utah since 2015, having lost 6 straight to the Utes. Utah's won 3 consecutive games in Tucson and the 6th straight overall since losing 37-30 in double overtime back in 2015. When you look at Arizona and what Jedd Fisch has been able to do, they ended a streak last week against Colorado where they had played 96 straight games between wins as a ranked team before sneaking by the Buffaloes. Arizona still has a path, however improbable, to get to the Pac-12 title game. If they win against Utah and Arizona State, UCLA upsets USC, Washington knocks off Oregon State, and Oregon State knocks off Oregon. Hey, the way this season has gone for the Wildcats, weirder things have happened. But clearly a lot of things have to fall the right way. Here comes a Utah team that was still trying to figure out in the aftermath of last week's game in Seattle what went wrong offensively in the second half. And it's always good when you get this quote from your head coach. I mean, I've watched the film 3 times and can't tell you why we were so productive in the first half. We blocked well, we caught well, we threw well, we ran well, and we did so many good things. And then we had just done half of that in the second half. We probably could have come away with the victory from Kyle Whittingham. Meanwhile, Utah, though, this is a role they flourished in. 10-2 ATS, the last 12 games, they've been a road underdog. Arizona, though, one of the best teams in the FBS, 8-2 against the number this season. They've also gone 8-2 to the under, and Arizona a perfect 5-0 when taking on ranked opponents. Brad, when you look at Arizona coming into the season, this was a team listed at 300-1 to have a chance to win the Pac-12. While that still appears to be unlikely, they've exceeded odds makers' expectations at every turn. What kind of adjustments have you made to this team's overall power rating? And what did you expect when Jaden Delora was injured and Noah Fafita filled in? And he's done so quite nicely as this Arizona team hasn't missed a beat.
Yeah, so massive upgrade for Arizona's power rating. 10 points. Maybe doesn't sound like much, but comparing that nationally, it's more than any other Power 5 team since the start of the season in the entire country, up 10 points. Meaning I would favor this current Arizona group right now here entering Game 11 by 10 over what I expected in the preseason. And sadly, another win total. That loser for me, under 5.5 wins. I expected it to be obviously a 5-7 type of team this year. I thought the schedule was more difficult than odds makers were giving credit at the start, but nothing fluky about this. I mean, you could say, they won a bunch of close games. No, I would argue it's the opposite. You don't have to get too creative to say this team could easily be 9-1 on the season. Probably should have won at Mississippi State if you go back to that game. And speaking of that game, kind of ties in well with the quarterback. Jaden Delora lost that game for Arizona. He did not take care of the football. He put it in harm's way several times in that game. So originally coming into the season in the summer, obviously it was a pretty substantial downgrade from Delora, a 2-year starter, a guy that's thrown for over 7,000 career passing yards, 63%, over 50 career touchdowns, down to a kid in Fafita that's 5'11", was only 9 out of 19 in limited action last year. I added 3.5 points to downgrade. My mind started to change a little bit in the Mississippi State game. Like, Delora is not as good as I anticipated as his 3rd year as a starting quarterback. And then obviously Fafita, the one thing he does well is he takes care of the football. He does take some sacks, but only 4 interceptions in all of his starts. So honestly, this is how dramatic of a change it is. If Fafita got ruled out today and Delore was going to be the starter, I'd actually downgrade Arizona's power rating a point and a half. I've seen enough data points. I know it's only 5 or 6, but that's how bad I thought Delore was in not taking care of the football, playing playground, running around. I don't know if that fits what Arizona wants to do here under Jedd Fisch. And Fafita's come in and done what they needed him to do: get the ball, distribute the ball, be a game manager. They do have playmakers. I know a lot of people aren't watching Arizona football, including even last week when it's the Pac-12 network against Colorado. Jonah Coleman's a very capable running back. This T-Mac kid was the highest rated recruit that they had at wide receiver in school history. He's lived up to that billing his first couple years. They have a legit NFL caliber tight end. He's going to get drafted in McLaughlin. So this is a legitimate Arizona team that rightfully so I've upgraded more than any other Power 5 team.
Yeah, thanks to Jaden Delore for throwing all those interceptions against Mississippi State. It gave us a cheap price to lay with LSU the following week for their trip to Starkville.
Yes.
That was a rocking chair winner, to say the least. You mentioned that receiving room. I mean, Cowing and McMillan have been absolutely incredible in terms of a 1-2 punch. 133 receptions between that tandem, over 1,300 yards and 18 touchdowns to go along with some of the other playmakers that you mentioned, and they're playing complementary football. I mean, it's almost like Arizona trying to bring back the Desert Swarm defense, holding opponents to less than 3 touchdowns a contest. Last year, they allowed 36.5 points per game, which was 126th in the FBS. Pretty crazy when you look at how the run defense has improved as well. 14th in the country, allowing 102 yards per game on the ground. Finished last year 115th in that department, allowing 202. Payne, if you're looking at the handicap in this game, is there one particular matchup that you think will go a long way in terms of deciding who comes away with the cash at the betting window?
Yeah, who comes away with the cash is going to be an interesting proposition here. I looked at this game and I was like, man, I kind of had an inclination where I wanted to go, and then all of a sudden I start digging in. And it's like, price-wise, Pickish seems fair if you believe everything Arizona is doing with Fafita is 100% their new normal. So the only way I kind of see a substantial buy coming in is if you believe Arizona's reached their peak price and, redshirt freshman can't continue his rate of play, or there's a piece of information or a matchup that would dictate an order. For me, just one of the tougher games, because you do have a freshman quarterback in Noah Fafita going up against a Kyle Whittingham defense, and that doesn't have really a great sound to it. You look at Fafita, he's got 6 data points as a starter. He is coming off his worst performance in completion rate, QBR, passer rating. It came against the worst of the 6 defenses Fafita's played. His best data point, though, his very best performance came against a UCLA defense that rating-wise is the closest to what he'll face here in Utah's defense. So there's some variance there within that. I think for Arizona to kind of pull this off, get a big win over Utah, it is on Fafita, right? The positive is we have seen this style of quick, short passing offense really worked this year against Utah's defense. And I know it's something we outlined, I believe, heading into the Oregon breakdown, but you go back again to week 1, Graham Mertz, 25 of 29 on throws inside of 9 yards against Utah, 65% passing success rate on standard downs using that quick throw game as an extension of the run. Week 8, Caleb Williams, 19 of 21, had nearly a 60% success rate throwing on standard downs. But again, just that short, quick pass really has worked against Utah. Then you go week 9, Bo Nix, 18 of 21 on throws 9 yards or shorter against Utah, was a plus passer again on standard downs in terms of success. And so when I look at Noah Fafita, right now, close to 70% of his passes are 9 yards or less. When he's kept clean, that ball is coming out quick, 2.1 seconds, lots of wide receiver screens. Jedd Fisch is clearly trying to limit the downside risk, and you can see that in the rate of big-time throws. Fafita's dropped back 254 times this season, only 4 big-time throws. So I think it's important that Jedd Fisch gets Fafita comfortable early, make last week's first half against Colorado a thing of the past, see the ball go through the hoop. Obviously, again, started a little rocky last week. The positive is one of the guys that's really involved in that wide receiver screen game, Jacob Cowing, couldn't finish the Colorado game. Jedd Fisch came out this week, said he envisions Cowing playing, so that would be a a nice get back when you think about that short throw game really needing to be how Arizona operates offensively and potentially is the reason they could win this game.
The game against Colorado is so interesting for a variety of reasons. I mean, Brad mentioned the fact that about 9 people across the country, including Arizona fans, were actually able to watch it on the Pac-12 network. It had marked a huge role reversal for an Arizona team that had gone into a slew of games, 5 in a row as an underdog, performing extremely well in that role to suddenly having a target on their back. And it almost looked in watching that game that they were playing with increased expectations and a little bit tighter. You wonder if getting back home to Tucson, they'll feel much more comfortable in this spot against the Utah team that I'm sure is still kicking themselves for what could have been in Seattle last weekend if they were able to move the football offensively and replicate what we saw in the first half. Speaking of Seattle, though, the Washington Huskies will make the trip south to Corvallis, Oregon to take on Oregon State. We've seen this game cross the 0 from where the number opened at some shops, with Washington a 1-point favorite. We're now looking at Oregon State. We'll call them pretty much a 2-point consensus favorite. Total on the game 64.5. 108th meeting between these two old rivals who first met on the gridiron back in 1897. In none of those previous 107 games were both teams ranked in the top 10 in the Associated Press poll, so a little bit of history potentially on the horizon. Reser Stadium no doubt should be buzzing. Tickets for going for 4 to 5 times face value for one of the league's smallest venues. And the last 2 meetings between the Huskies and Beavers have been decided by exactly 3 points. There's no doubt Oregon State fans felt a little bit disrespected by College Game Day, as Game Day elect to go to Harrisonburg, Virginia for JMU against App State instead of making the trip out for Washington against Oregon State. Big picture implications, gentlemen. Washington, obviously everything to play for. Go out, run the table, win the Pac-12 championship. You're not going to be kept out of the college football playoff. Meanwhile, Oregon State controls their own destiny. If they're able to win in back-to-back weeks, would send them to the conference title game. You look at Washington, 17 straight wins, the second longest streak in program history since a 22-game win streak spanned from 1990 to 1992. However, the defense is taking on a bit of water. Allowed 28-plus points in 3 straight games, 24-plus points in 6 of 7 Pac-12 games. The only exception was a 15-7 game against Arizona State, and it was more the Sun Devils shooting themselves in the foot in the red zone than anything else. Also, this is a Huskies team -1 in the turnover margin, tied for 77th in the country. Oregon State, 8-2, best through the 10 games since 2012. Only other time they've been 8-2 or better since a 9-1 start back in 2000. 2 losses this year by a combined 6 points. It's the lowest marginal loss in the FBS for teams with more than 1 loss. They've been dominant at home, 5-0 this season, all wins coming by 12-plus points, and they're tied for the second longest streak at the FBS level at home, a 9-game run spanning 1999 to 2000. Great in the turnover margin, and there is no doubt Oregon State will embrace this opportunity. But Brad, the Beavers haven't seen a high-flying passing attack like they're going to encounter here with Michael Penix, and quietly a dynamic offense may even be able to add one more playmaker back into the fold, as there's a lot of optimism out in the Washington campus that McMillan could get in there and actually serve a very valuable role opposite Udunze and Polk against a beleaguered Beavers secondary.
Yeah, first I'll talk about the early week money here being on Oregon State. I understand it. I get it. Washington has been very fortunate here. 6 straight wins by 10 points or less. Oregon State's a much better team at home than on the road. But with that being said, you cannot ignore the advantage here for Washington clearly on this side of the ball with their you mentioned that by far the best offense that Oregon State's faced this season, particularly Washington's strength on offense against Oregon State's weakness on defense, that being in the throw game. Penix obviously right up there, top 10 weighted EPA per play. He's looked better in recent weeks after that catastrophe against Arizona State. Run game, I mentioned it, needed to be competent, needed to be more balanced. Dylan Johnson last week even showed that against a tough Utah front, 100 yards for him there. I'm not sure that they try for balance this week or that it'd be the most optimal way to really get after Oregon State. You mentioned McMillan getting healthy. With him being out of the lineup, they find a couple wide receivers not as good, but the one thing I have noticed is a couple of tight ends have really emerged for him. Obviously, you still have Udunze and Polk, and I'm worried because on the other side of the ball, you got an Oregon State defense. The counting stats say top 40. If you're looking at yards per play, yards per game, points per game, Who have they faced? I mean, particularly at quarterback so far. If you start going through the schedule, remember
Chevin
Utah
Cordero, Brad. That's probably the best.
Yes, all the way back to the week 1 on a Sunday game. And San Jose State moved the ball a little bit there. Utah's quarterback was banged up. Barnes got hurt in that game, ended up in the hospital. Cal was a freshman quarterback, and he went up and down the field in his first start in that game. UCLA had Dante Moore, a freshman on the road. And UCLA moved the football in that game. There was Dante Moore just being a freshman having some mistakes there. I mean, Fafita was efficient, but efficient compared to what Michael Penix and this passing offense is. I mean, it's night and day. The two corners are a major weakness for Oregon State. Safety plays okay. The question I have to ask is Oregon State's strength. They've dialed up pressure, 19 sacks the last 4 games. The problem is that's also Washington's strength on offense is they don't give up any sacks. So I'm not sure that they're going to be able to get pressure. So I get the money and I get the thought process on Oregon State here being the slight favorite, but my goodness, that Washington's offense has the edge over Oregon State's defense.
You mentioned that offensive line for Washington, Brad, that's been great in pass protection. They're even starting to get a little bit more balance. I mean, I'm not going to use the data point against USC as a litmus test for Dylan Johnson and what he's capable of doing, but against Utah and against Oregon, I mean, he still had 100-yard games, so a little bit more balance coming from this Washington offense as they realize as the stakes mean a little bit more, you have to provide a little bit of a ground threat to keep opposing defenses honest. Payne, when you look at the other side of the ball, the Beavers offense exploded for 60 points versus Stanford, just the 3rd time they've done it in a league game since 1980. The 45-point win was the largest margin of victory over the Cardinal, and it was a season-high 595 yards of offense, with 335 of those coming in the first half. DJU has cut down on the turnovers, 12 touchdowns, no interceptions over his last 5 games, but he only has 54 completions total during that 4-game span. So you wonder if Oregon State's playing from behind in known passing situations, if they'll be able to do things through the air. Damian Martinez, look, he's the bell cow back, and he's kind of led the charge. 102 yards per game, 15th in the FBS, 6.6 yards per rush, has him inside the top 20, and in terms of overall counting stats, he's inside the top 15. Meanwhile, this is a Huskies defense that gives up 300-yard passing performances, allows you to run the football for 200-plus yards, doesn't do anything well from a success rate standpoint on the ground, but when you're complemented by a high-flying offense, you don't have to be great every series. You don't have to be great down to down. Come up with the timely stop like you did against USC, put together a second half like you did against Utah, and that's part of the reason the Huskies come into this game with 0 losses in the loss column.
Yeah, this is, to me, one of the more interesting games in that there's 2 matchups that are going to determine it, and both are crystal clear because it's strength on weakness in both situations. Brad outlined the first one, and the thought process is how this game can have so much variance, because if Washington can get a timely stop early and you go back-to-back touchdown possessions for Washington, you can build the lead. Suddenly, all of a sudden, like Oregon State, the idea of them being, playing that hammer role, it becomes a little bit more difficult. If this turns into a little bit of a grinder and Oregon State can get that ground game going where they have a massive edge, suddenly you could see Washington being on the ropes. The Achilles heel of Washington from the onset of this season until the very moment is something we've discussed countless times. It's the issues Washington faces with physicality in their defensive front. Even in the context of this not being, I would say, normal college football season, where there's like a clear-cut powerhouse or 2 or 3 dominant teams, it's just hard to fathom a team making the college football playoff with the kind of defensive front Washington has. You look at just schedule adjusted, Washington is outside the top 100 in defensive line yards allowed, defensive line havoc created, tackles for loss, EPA per rush allowed, and that's really the MO of Oregon State offensively. Before the season, I think we thought the Beavers' offensive line was projected to either be first or second best in the Pac-12. Now, it hasn't always played to expectation this season, but Oregon State's ground game is just, it's so efficient, down to down, top 7 in the country in rushing success rate. You mentioned Damian Martinez. You also have Deshaun Fenwick. They have enough juice to hit explosives as well, top 25 in explosive rush percentage. You look at Martinez averaging nearly 2.8 yards per rush before first contact. In high leverage games like this, you would expect DJU to be involved in the run game more as well. And then you just kind of look at the schedule, right? Against rushing offenses in the class of Oregon State, both Oregon and USC had field days on the ground against Washington. The Huskies are also not the best tackling team, barely top 50 in the country. And then you look at Martinez and Fenwick, how they run, they're averaging a combined 3.8 yards per rush after first contact. You go back to last season's matchup. Galbranson is QB3 heading into the season. He ended up playing in this game for Oregon State. Wasn't a threat to complete the forward pass. Washington has one focus, right? Stop the run. Martinez and Fenwick combined average 6 yards a carry in that game. And, because Oregon State has this matchup advantage, they're likely going to win the early down battle. That means less throwing in known passing situations for DJU, which you kind of highlighted there, Todd, at the top, saying he's only, had a couple passes the last month or so. But it very much comes down to the style. Can Washington, get that stop on third and short? Can they get that stop, at midfield when Oregon State inevitably goes for it on 4th and 1 to create that extra possession? Because if they can, and you can get out, I just don't see a path to where, Oregon State is stopping Washington's throw game. So it's just two diametrically different teams here, and it'll be interesting to see which style wins in this spot. Is it the 2023 high flying offense? Is it the 1993 ground and pound? But that's what makes this game so fun.
It's always so tough to wrap your head around some of that because we've talked about it, and you guys have pointed out to me. The value in the explosive plays and the ability to pick up chunk yardage when things are going poorly, that would clearly favor Washington in this spot. We saw Oregon State earlier this year, albeit in hostile territory in Pullman, Washington, where the ground game wasn't able to get going early. They gave up a few explosives and then really had to chuck their way to get back into it. And the final score, not nearly as indicative of how dominant Washington State was in that game. Ironically enough, might be the last time that Washington State actually looked like a capable and competent football team, given what we've seen from the Cougars over the last handful of weeks. So you love contrast and styles. We say styles make fights, and that should be the perfect illustration for what we're going to see in Corvallis and what should be an electric atmosphere for a team that very much controls its own destiny in the Pac-12 race, but will have its work cut out for it, needing to knock off Washington and Oregon if they want to get to Vegas for that first Friday in December. We also have some other conference championship races, gentlemen, and I know we don't always spend a ton of time talking about the G5 conferences other than when Brad's identified a little bit of value that's out there. But two games that stand out this week. One will take us to the Liberty Bowl, where SMU comes into this game as more than a touchdown favorite. A large total at 65.5, and SMU has beaten Memphis in 2 out of the last 3 games. But when you look at how Memphis has performed in a much larger sample size, they've had SMU's number from an ATS standpoint. SMU, you can look at what the Mustangs have done, but you can begin to question it as well with one of the nation's softest strength of schedules to date. They do remain one of 3 unbeaten teams in the AAC. They won't play UTSA or Tulane. Those 2 teams will play on Black Friday next week. And SMU has rattled off 6 straight wins after starting the season 2-2. Their only losses coming against Oklahoma and TCU, but you dig into who they've played, and again, not a murderer's row by any stretch of the imagination. Meanwhile, for Memphis, 4 straight wins since losing to Tulane. They come into this contest fresh off a 44-38 overtime win against Charlotte. Their last 3 wins by 18 points combined after starting the win streak with a 24-point win over UAB. And Memphis, well, they've underwhelmed in this last 4-game stretch, going 1-3 ATS with the wins against Charlotte, UAB, North Texas, and USF. But Brad, SMU got their starting quarterback back last week in Preston Stone. Didn't have to do a whole heck of a lot as everybody else got involved in their big win against North Texas. In steps a Memphis defense that, well, I'm not even sure I'll call it a defense, leaves a lot to be desired with their inability to stop the run and stop the pass.
Yeah, so, if we were doing this podcast, I would anticipate 10 years ago that, SMU would have been the non-Powers 5 best bet. I don't think 10 years ago you're laying 8 here. You're probably laying 6. I think SMU clearly far and away the better team here. You mentioned strength of schedule, questionable for SMU. You can once the schedule's set, you can't control who you play, but you can control how you play. And if you just look at basic counting stats, SMU has dominated their opponents. They're number 8 in yards per play margin, number 5 in points per game margin, number 3 in yards per game margin. They destroyed their conference opposition so far. And then you just look at the team on tape. I go back to week 2 against Oklahoma. I mean, they can be, that wasn't a fluky performance. There was fluky that Oklahoma ended up winning the game by 17 because you watch the first 3 quarters, SMU played them straight up. I mean, to a man. That was they held up well at the line of scrimmage. They held up well on the outside. And when you start looking at some of the talent that SMU has, I mean, Jalen Knighton from Miami, the highly rated kid. Their backup running back was a former 5-star. Preston Stone was a 4-star recruit, one of the highest rated recruits in the history of SMU, or at least post-death penalty. RJ Maryland, a tight end, was a highly rated recruit. They have this kid off the edge, and Elijah Roberts. He was at Miami. He's their leading sacker. Jonathan McGill at safeties from Stanford. He was a starter at Stanford. He's playing well. So I really think this is a legit team. I tweeted after the Oklahoma game that I thought this is the best Group of 5 team in the country, and here we are 2 months later, and I still think SMU is the best Group of 5 team in the country. On the other side, I think Memphis is a fraud. You mentioned
don't mince words, Brad. Tell us how you really feel about the Tigers.
Yeah, well, I mean, you mentioned the close games. Just look at it. They stopped Navy was going to score late in that game, and they stopped them at the 10-yard line. Otherwise, that could have been a loss. They get a blocked field goal return for a touchdown against Boise State, and what ended up being just a 3-point win. So a 10-point play on one play ended up turning into, from a loss to a win. They played a backup quarterback against UAB and were +4 in turnovers. Stats say they shouldn't have won in a blowout. They hit I just watched some of their games. They hit a 40-yard touchdown pass with 12 seconds left to beat North Texas. Other than that could have been a loss. They're down 10.
That game was the biggest shit show I think I've watched all year in college football. If people want to go back and watch 2 teams that want to play no defense and just look to get off the field as fast as they can, that game in Denton, Texas was truly something special.
In fairness, they were the right side for the majority of that game. Then they just forgot to play defense in the fourth quarter, and you thought they were going to lose. But last week probably could have been a loss. They're down 10 late, and by late I mean middle of the fourth quarter, and they rallied to beat Charlotte in overtime. They do, in fairness, I like their skill position talent. Hennigan's solid. Running back Watson's good. Got a couple of good, decent wide receivers. But you hit it. This defense is atrocious. They had 2 dominant performances in the first 2 weeks against terrible offenses, an FCS offense, and Arkansas State didn't figure out the quarterback at that point. Last 8 games, this defense is allowing 480 yards per game, and now they're facing arguably the most talented offense they've faced all year. SMU for me.
Look, I backed them +7, Memphis that is, on a neutral against Missouri early in the year, +7, and felt fortunate to get a push out of that game. If those 2 teams played now, I think Missouri could score 60 without breaking much of a sweat, given what we've seen from Memphis and their inability to stop the run and inability to stop the pass. Payne, anything you'd like to add here before we have one more Group of 5 gem that we're going to get to?
I thought Brad hit it perfectly that you just don't love laying multiple scores on the road in a game like this, but we've been down on Memphis. We don't love the head coach. SMU has the best unit on the field with their defense. I think if SMU gets the good version of Preston Stone, they're going to cover this number pretty comfortably, but he has downtrended in recent times, right? It's kind of understandable against an under-the-radar Rice defense, but then Stone follows it up with his worst performance of the season against a very poor North Texas defense. I didn't see that coming. I was hoping for, a good data point there to make you feel comfortable that he can fully exploit a very porous Memphis defense. But I think, to me, it's like we were all kind of hoping to lay, a worst-case scenario 7 in the situation, and the number just has not given us that opportunity.
You mentioned the game against North Texas. I do wonder how the preparation for that contest was impacted with concussion protocol as he kind of went through a number of things there. But yes, 11 for 20 against that Mean Green defense. Nothing to write home about by any stretch of the imagination.
And yet they still covered. Yep. I mean, I had a North Texas ticket, and I don't. He hasn't. You're right. He hasn't played that well, but yet they're still killing teams. That's how much talent. This is a Power 5 talented football team in SMU.
It sounds cliche to say, but they remind me an awful lot of Tulane last year, and we'll see if they can complete the task at hand, win out the 2 remaining regular season games, and take on the winner of Tulane UTSA in a conference championship game, and potentially be that G5 representative in one of the big bowl games when we get into the holiday season. And
they're only going to continue to trend up.
Well,
right?
if Rhett stays around.
They've bought their way into the ACC, correct?
Yeah.
And they are very serious about football right now.
Yep.
and they are getting some talent. I don't think it's going to hit immediately, but if you kind of spanned out and said, hey, like, who's the team in the ACC that's going to be semi-serious about football and can make a move in the next, like, 3 to 5 years, you're probably picking a team like SMU over, like, the Wake Forest. Yeah, the Wake Forests and the Dukes, right? And teams of that nature. So SMU is serious about football right now.
I don't know about you guys, but I am thrilled to watch ACC games between SMU and Stanford next year on the CW. That'll be exactly the kind of college football that all of us were raised on when we talk about conference championship implications on a variety of fronts. All right, guys, one final game to get to, and it is the local boys, UNLV, in an improbable season, fighting to try and get to a Mountain West championship game under first-year head coach Barry Odom. They'll go on the road to Colorado Springs as a field goal underdog. There is a 3.5 out there if you like to dog shop around a little bit. Total in the game 47. And the forecast looks relatively clear for the Rebels in this spot. A low of 35 in Colorado Springs, a high of 58, which I'm sure UNLV is thrilled about. The winner of this game takes sole possession of the Mountain West, but they still have work to do in their following games as well. Air Force comes into the game looking to avoid a 3-game losing streak for the first time since 2018. There are 3-game losing streaks potentially, and then there are 2-game losing streaks like Air Force is on, where they've lost not once but twice outright each of the last 2 weeks as more than an 18-point underdog. Air Force beat UNLV 42-7 last year, ran for 406 yards in that game, and held the Rebels to less than 200 yards. When you look at UNLV this season, 2 losses this season. One at Michigan, you can understand completely, and then they also lost in the Valley against Fresno State, where they dropped a potential game-winning touchdown pass in the closing seconds. And when I say drop, it hit him in the hands, and he looked like Featherstone from unnecessary roughness, which should have been a touchdown 99 out of 100 times. It's a 5-game win streak, the team's longest since 1984 when Randall Cunningham was under center. 8 wins for the first time as a program since they went 8-5 back in 2000. But you look at UNLV, Brad, in the betting market, and let's be honest, the market has hated them in 2 of the last 3 games. Last week against Wyoming in a game on Friday night, you saw them get dummied up to 5.5, and then it looked like people were betting the game like they knew the final score, with that game closing UNLV a soft 3. 2 weeks before, it was all about Mikey Keene and Fresno State. That game went from 7 to 7.5 before it closed 11.5, and the Rebels arguably the dead right side in that spot. But here comes an Air Force team licking their wounds, trying to figure out how to get back on track, but some major injury concerns for the propeller heads as they figure out what their identity will be for their final 2 regular season games.
Yeah, let's first. I'll tackle UNLV before we talk about the main reason as far as the price in this game. But UNLV 9-1 against the spread, best in the country this year. Cover margin 11.5 points per game. They're super consistent. They don't have any bad performances really this year. The one game that they didn't cover, okay, they still beat Colorado State in that game and they needed a field goal. So what makes this team click? I mean, not a lot of weaknesses. I mean, for a team with a first-year coach and young coordinators, they're deep at running back. They got a young quarterback that's getting better. He's definitely more accurate, Maava, than Brumfield was, so I like him. Ricky White at wide receiver, if you haven't watched UNLV football, I mean, should be still playing in the Big Ten, and he'd be an all Big Ten type wide receiver, so he's dominating the Mountain West. You mentioned Air Force. Let's get to, one thing I do want to mention on the price and UNLV taking money against them. I don't know about you guys, but anytime, I don't care if it's UNLV basketball, UNLV football, whether it's, for them, with them or against them in the market, when I see something move 3-4 points, I mean, it raises my eyebrows with UNLV sports. So the fact that it's 10 minutes into the game, all that Wyoming money on game day, it is a total. I'm 21-0. Yep. 10 minutes in the game. I mean, Wyoming fought back a little bit, but then UNLV controlled the second half. So, man, that money was dead wrong. Speaking of dead wrong, if you've been betting Air Force the last 2 weeks, dead wrong. I mean, so what's the issue? I go back to the Larrier injury. Not last week. I go back several weeks ago where Troy Calhoun mentioned, hey, he's going to be out for a while. I mean, by a while, you thought he meant like a month.
6 days, Brad. 6 days is a while, apparently, at the service academies.
Yeah, so the expectation, okay, he's going to be out for a while. He comes back. He plays against Navy. They get the win there. They win in the snow against Colorado State. And then the turnover machine happens where he just doesn't look right. Not only against Army where they were -6 in turnovers, but even at the start of last week's game, they just did not look right. Ended up being -4 in turnovers. Larry, or the quarterback, ends up sitting out a majority of that game. And this market right now is telling you that he's doubtful, not questionable, but doubtful. Because we'd be sitting here, if he was more probable, we'd be sitting probably with a 6-point spread here. So I go back to the fact that maybe he came back too soon. Magically, I mean, if you're talking about him being out a month and he was only out 6 days, we see quarterbacks get rushed in too soon. We got another data point this year in that being the case at Duke, and Riley Leonard was probably rushed back, and then all of a sudden now you lose the quarterback for multiple games instead of just a few that where you needed to rest him. Jensen Jones would be a 3-point downgrade, to say the least. So if Jensen Jones in here, UNLV's live as far as I'm concerned, because they just don't have the throw game. They don't have the consistency even in the run game with them. And I'll tell you, want to talk about bad beats? I have Air Force over 8 wins. I'm not confident I'm going to that's going to be a winning ticket. I mean, right now, I mean, it might look like a push.
When you look at, I mean, I know we talked a little about the Air Force side. You mentioned Ricky White. I mean, what have you seen from Jaden Maiava? I mean, he was billed as one of the top recruits that UNLV had landed. You thought it was going to be temporary with him taking over when Doug Brumfield went down with injury early in the year, but Maiava has really looked the part in terms of providing balance, both in the ground game and as that consummate point guard, getting Ricky White involved.
Yeah, well, obviously talented. I mean, had a lot of fanfare coming in. I didn't see it last year, and he had some limited time last year. Didn't really even see it in the spring game as much, but they put him in good positions. I love the coordinator, the young offense coordinator for the UNLV. They don't put a lot on his plate. It's easy throwing to a guy like Ricky White, who's just more talented than anybody in the defensive backfields in any program in the Mountain West. He takes care of the football for a young kid that doesn't have a lot of experience. He's more accurate than Brumfield was.
He was.
I didn't like him.
He was a chucker.
Yeah, I don't think he fit well with this system. So let's turn around and hand it off. We're running the go-go system. We have 2 running backs in the backfield. Just distribute the football. Don't turn it over, and that's what he's done. So kudos to the kid.
Hey, look, I mean, this isn't a probable turnaround. We've talked about UNLV having the resources to be a football, not juggernaut, but look, in the landscape of the Mountain West, there's no reason for UNLV with the right coaching not to be more relevant, and we'll see if they're able to get to the Mountain West Championship. We talked a little bit about Arizona being a long shot to get to the postseason early in the year. UNLV, very similar price point. If you shop around, you could have had them at a massive number to try and win the Mountain West. You can follow Brad on Twitter at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You follow me on social media. And most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. All right, my friend, it's the portion of the program where we go to best bet territory. Joe Milton will not be getting any Christmas gifts from us, nor will Ron Slay, given what we saw from the Volunteers last weekend in Columbia. What do we think provides a little bit of an opportunity this fine Saturday?
It's a tough question. Board's a little rocky this week.
A lot of disagreement. It's starting to feel like
nicely.
the NFL, unfortunately.
That is the case. This one for me, and I know you and I have discussed this a little bit off air, it's not pretty. I wouldn't watch the game. I'm not going to be watching the game. I would advise you guys to all do the same. The price for us, though, is a little bit off within this game for us. I mean, through a key number, no less. Got to go back to the well here on Sparty as a road dog. 327. We'll call it Michigan State plus the 4.5. I just can't get to this number. And I'm looking at our power ratings, and it's a virtual pick 'em on a neutral. And so I didn't realize this was a rivalry.
That makes 2 of us when I was digging into it earlier. Do you want to share with our listeners what the name of the rivalry trophy they'll be playing for this weekend is?
Old Brass Spittoon.
Do you have a couple of those in your place?
So, I that's funny. I do not, but I look at this and then compare the power rating, which shows value to the matchup, and you are getting the better defense. You're getting the slightly better running offense on paper, and so it just becomes difficult not to take that value. But again, I will not be watching this. I would suggest you guys do the same and just kind of check the score after the game, and that's probably the best for your mental state.
By hook or by
affairs.
crook, Michigan State becomes best bet for the second time. They were good to us against Rutgers. And when you look at Indiana, they do not have a long history, my friend, of being a favorite in Big Ten conference games. I looked over my notes. It's happened twice over the last 2+ seasons. Last year in the season opener, they took massive money against them, against Illinois, win the game 23-20. Not quite sure how they got to the finish line there. And the season before, they closed a 7-point favorite against Rutgers, lost that game 38-3. So I know Indiana has trended up in recent weeks, but it's a little bit of a different dynamic when you go from being the hunter to suddenly being the hunted. Sure, it's senior day, early kickoff in Bloomington, minimum home field advantage, but you also wonder if Indiana had their guts ripped out to a certain extent last week, knowing that they had Illinois in overtime, a chance to get one step closer to bowl eligibility, something that they had talked about over the last couple weeks. Alas, they're not here. Not saying Michigan State necessarily wins the game outright, but asking Indiana to win by margin feels like a big request for an offense and primarily a defense that's rather limited with some of their capabilities.
Different role reversal for sure. And those are kind of the favorites you're looking to fade, right? When they start going and covering numbers as dogs to now kind of asking to win by margin. And that's exactly why I think, our number is showing some value here. I don't think we can get any lower on Michigan State. And, we've been very conservative in some of those things. So I just, I even in like the best case situation, like I don't get to even 3 here. It's like 2.8 at the most. So grabbing 4.5 makes
you close 4 at Rutgers in early October, a team that's a little bit more buttoned up. You have a chance to win that game if it's not for some turnovers and some craziness late in the game. And now suddenly you go to Bloomington and you're catching 4.5 against an Indiana team that, like we said, unfamiliar territory laying points. So it's not always a beauty pageant, but sometimes those are some of the best bets. You have to look for the ugly ducklings late in the year more so than focus on some of the marquee matchups. All right, my friend, NFL on the docket tomorrow, holiday schedule potentially in the mix. We'll share that with the listeners, but I think we've spent enough time. If listeners only knew a fraction of what went on behind the scenes from a deliberation standpoint to arrive at a best bet, they would be thoroughly entertained. Anything else you'd like to add before we bid them a fond farewell for 24 hours?
That's it. Back
all right,
tomorrow.
Sounds good. So come Saturday, early kickoff, Bloomington, Indiana, Michigan State, plus 4.5 ticket in hand. We will see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.